Dear ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to the International Open Seminar on Semiotics. We are very close to the end of our seminar, and today we are delighted to host the lecture by Professor Dr. Mahmoud Reza Moghaddam Shad, which is entitled Becoming Minority, Subjectivity and Suprasubjectivity. It's a pleasure to receive you, Dr. Shad, at our seminar. Thanks you very much. Let me please say a few words in order to introduce you to our audience. Dr. Mahmoud Reza Moghaddam Shad holds PhD in political theory from the University of Tehran. He is the co-founder and a member of the executive board of the Iranian Society for Phenomenology, the specialized secretary of the Iranian Yearbook of Phenomenology, and a former member of the Intellectual Trends Group of the Center of Middle East Strategic Studies. His research interests are phenomenology of everyday life and politics, resentment, identity politics, minority politics, democracy theory, sociology of knowledge, and sociology of knowable. His recent publications are Becoming Minority as a Revolutionary Act, an introduction to the idea of minoritarian democracy, an article in Quarterly Journal of Politics, The Image of Government in Iranian Fiction, and many other publications in most respectful scientific journals. You can find the list on our website. Thank you very much, Dr. Shad. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yulia. Thank you very much, actually. And actually, I was a member of the Iranian Society for Phenomenology, and I'm no longer. And I actually had a great time with that guys, but we are not anymore in connection. I want to thank you for inviting me and having me today. It's a real honor, actually. I don't know. I'm not actually, to be honest, I'm not a semiotician. I would be someday. I would like to be someday, but not yet. And I'm not a philosopher even. I want to call myself a philosopher maybe. And my first encounter with semiotics was thanks to William and Robert here about 2 years ago in 2021. And before that, I never heard of semiotics. I only heard socials and semiology, and to be honest, it was not my cup of tea, let's say. And but when they introduced me to John Deely, and I started to read some of his papers and then his books, and it was very amazing, especially the idea of when he tried to thematize the relation as an ontological being. And so today I'm going to talk about this and idea of becoming minority in Deleuze and Guattari's works. But before I begin, I would like to ask for, let's say, 10 seconds of silence in respect for showing our respect for and solidarity with women in Iran, as you know, as you heard from Iran. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now let's see. Yeah, all right. Viva la revolution. Yeah, let's see if I can share my, well, I think you must enable me to Let me to share my PowerPoint with you, if you may. Yeah, you can see it, right? Yeah, that's great. So let's begin from the first slide. By the way, before I begin, I should thank my dear friend Zahra for creating this colorful PowerPoint. As you will see, it's very, full of motions and graphic designs, and oh, perfect. Okay, today I will try to present an understanding of the concept of becoming in Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, while considering a possible semiotic narrative of it. First, shortly, I review some references in Deleuze's works to Peircean semiotics, particularly in its difference from the duality of signifier and signified in semiology. Then I will focus on the concept of becoming and try to present a new interpretation of it, based on John Deely's concepts of suprasubjectivity and ontological relation, which also Paul Baines had a comprehensive account of it in his book, The Primacy of Semiosis and Ontology of Relations, which published in 2006. Finally, after mentioning the new definition of majority and minority in Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, I will discuss the becoming minority as an ideal model of becoming, while introducing the special situation of minorities in the block of becoming. This special situation, as I describe it, plays a crucial role in triggering becoming as it proliferates new relations and alliances, along with the deterritorialization of the previous order and arrangements of sign relations based on the emergence of unexpected interpretants. So let's start with Deely. Deely clearly separates his usage of the term postmodernity in the doctrine of science from that of the so-called French bloc, including Deleuze, Guattari, Derrida, and Foucault, among others, calling their philosophy ultra-modernity and sees them share the same fate with modern idealists and nominalists. For Deely, these French writers play on the same chord as Saussure in his semiology or science of sign, neglecting the hardcore reality or ens reale altogether. He says, if you try to make from Saussure's model a general science of science, then you are not dealing with something that is postmodern, but with something that is 100% modern, indeed ultra-modern. That is modernity carried to its absolute extreme, where everything becomes creation of the mind, where you can make anything mean whatever you want it to mean. End of quotation. So not so good for postmoderns like Deleuze and Guattari so far. Nevertheless, I believe we can find some similarities between Deleuze and Deely, particularly regarding suprasubjectivity as singularity or being proper to all relations as relation, as Deely says, with what Paul Baines calls the interbeing or being in the middle of relation in Deleuze's philosophy. Being a characteristic of ontological or external relations, as Deleuze called it, instead of ontological relation, it says external relations. This suprasubjectivity or in-betweenness of relation beyond any intersubjective interaction plays an important role in both semiosis as a periodic relation as well as in the philosophy of becoming. Well, there is little doubt that Deleuze never compromised with semiology for many reasons, including its linguistic structuralism, along with the circular and infinite referential of signs in signifier-signified duality, which he, together with Guattari, comprehensively described in the fifth Plato of 1000 Platos, published in 1980, as a signifying regime of signs. However, before his lectures between 1981 to 1985, which were later published as 2 volumes of cinema. Deleuze never mentions Pierre's name but once, in the end note 41 of Plato 5, where he mistakenly claims that Pierre's semiotic is based on the dyadic relation of signifier and signified. However, as Cardoso Jr. asserts in his article in 2018, this misunderstanding was resolved peacefully by Deleuze in cinema lectures, where he would reassume instead the triadicity to recognize Pierre's semiotic, his work. In the final remarks, Cardoso argues that, he says, Deleuze's empiricist concept of habit relations, as much as the Deleuzian definition of semiotic and sign, resonates Pierre's triadic logic. End of quote. While defining firstness as affection or habit of feeling, and secondness as action or habit of action, Deleuze understood Peircean thirdness as mental image or general habit of relations. He says the point of thirdness was a term that referred to a second term through the intermediary of another term or terms. This third instance appeared in signification, law, or relation. End of quote. However, this image is not just a pure awareness-dependent object, since also being known as the object of thought, like the object of perception, it has its own existence. Relation has its own existence outside thought, or as awareness independent. Deleuze says it is an image which takes as its object relations, symbolic acts, and intellectual feelings. We will return to this shortly. So let's begin with the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari. Many scholars have tried to find a trend of family resemblance in their literature so far, namely continuity, creation, difference or multiplicity, external relations or interbeing, as Paul Baines suggests, nomad thought, and others, to name but a few. But I would rather prefer to call it a philosophy of becoming. Then immediately a question emerges, what is becoming? Or asking it as Deleuze and Guattari would, what is its use, its usage for philosophy, politics, life, whatever? Whereas any attempt to define and hence delimit the virtual potency of concepts in Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, including the becoming, would deprive of its possible meanings in the future, we must be very cautious in this task. As Brian Massumi points out, Deleuze and Guattari suggests we can use their treasury of concepts as a toolbox pragmatically. So we may reach for these concepts as becoming, say, as a compass to navigate us in our journey, as long as we will be able to read them one way or another. In that case, we would understand becoming from different perspectives, each of them covering an aspect of it, a continuous movement or change, a process of genuine creation, multiplicities, unexpected alliance, etc. All of which would be based on a relation or relations that should not be understood solely according to their terms or even based on a predetermined telos. Borrowing from Deely's terms, I would say it is a fundamental term in gazing at suprasubjectivity instead of the intersubjective facet of a relation, regarding Peircean thirdness as a triadic relation of sign. According to John Deely, although every relation is founded on the basis of its terms as its ground, being them subjective things or purely objective ones, every relation has its own ontological status, which will sustain even long after the departure of whatever is related. For instance, as a father remains his son's father for the son and for the ones who know them directly or indirectly, even after he passed away. Here we encounter yet another level of reality, namely the ontological relation, which is per se indifferent and prior to any further distinction between enstrale and enstrationist, awareness independent and awareness dependent in understanding. So this indifference is like a key measure for opening the unduly sealed gate between subject and object, spirit and body, phenomenon and nomenon, inner world and outer world, and even culture and nature in Western modern philosophy since Descartes. So it can be like a key measure. Following John of St. Thomas, aka John Ponso, Deely argues that the famous Aristotelian categories of being as are inadequate, for they do not include relations as being toward another, which comprehensive to both enstrationism as purely objective relations, as well as to ens reale or physical or better to say intersubjective relations. This suprasubjective character of the ontological relation is essential to Deely's postmodern doctrine of science. Although it is tempting to regard this new status of relation as being suprasubjective, not just as a part of the old Aristotelian categories of being, but as a revolutionary concept that changes the whole table altogether. While Deely distinguishes half of the list of 10 categories, namely vestition, verb, bend, posture, and relation as such, as being toward or as at, in contrast to being in or essaying, both in itself, that means substance, or in another, as for inherent accidents, namely quality, quantity, action, and passion. Perhaps we can go further and reconsider the holy status of substance and its innate essence cut off from the rest of the universe as an individual existence based on its substantial form and its principle of unity. So, while causal interaction between physical entities is dyadic, semiosis, or the action of sign, as the only form of causality that can directly involve non-being, is always a triadic relation. In other words, semiosis consists of a third party, the interpretant, which demonstrates how a signifier or a representamen can signify something other than itself, namely a significate or an object in its authentic sense of being known. Here, interpretant represents the ground, as Deely says, on which the two other elements can link objectively beyond their causal interaction and form a sign relation in addition to the physical relation. For example, when a cloud is experienced as a sign of rain by an animal who already experienced being rained upon. We can define interpretant as an effect upon a person, as Pierce did, but we have to be aware that here upon a person is only a subtle careless to make it understood for us, as Pierce desperately admits it. Yet, from another point of view, the interpretant is a proper significant outcome of the sign apart from its context and circumstances of utterance, which need not to be a mental mode of being, as Peirce defined it. Nevertheless, Deely points it out that consider as founding a determinate relation of signification for some animal, not restricted to a human being, the interpretant will be a mental mode of being, as an rationalist. Finally, it can be understood as an idea in a semiotic, not a psychological sense. When considering the organism experiencing as a side of in and out, but it can also be a code on the side of umbel, or what Deely called umbel as a specifying objective form, and the code where it belongs to the object experience. So as an idea in the in Umlaut or as a code in Umlaut. Considering this clarification, we can claim that interpreton may exist virtually in the physical world, or physiosemiotics, as Deely calls it, only to be actualized by an organism experiencing and applying to its favor, so to find a proper nourishment for itself, or even understood as an objective relation by an intelligent animal like human. Moreover, are there purely objective relations of signs that function as an interpretant only to receive a predator by imitating an authentic sign relation? For example, a frog or a snake that looks poisonous, but actually not. In both cases, it is the suprasubjective being of any relation as ontological relation in its indifference to what is real or not that allows the interpretant to function as a ground of any sign relation. According to Baines, a more developed theory of signs consists of an analysis of his words, how signs become or grow, and how they can do this without the need for physical existent terms. This problem of becoming of signs is crucial for us if we should consider an alliance between the new doctrine of science and the Deleuzian doctrine of becoming, whether it be a breakthrough from Pierre's or a new interpretation of his philosophy. Kamini Belodi, in her article with the title of Diagrammatic Thought, which published in 2014, compares Deleuze's philosophy of difference with what she calls the Peircean idealist philosophy of representation, on the basis of the different approach toward the diagram. That is, as a map or a scheme of thinking or signification or a method of discovery for Peirce versus a map of lines of flight or escape for Deleuze. She says, whilst Peirce's diagrammatic thought expands thought beyond what is immediately self-evident to it by constructing mediated possibilities on the basis of what is inherently possible for thought, Deleuze's diagram is a construction of new possibilities that explode that which inheres in thought, explode a thought as a form of inherence, and force a thought to on a line of flight with the outside, the intensive outside of pure difference. A thought without image, the Deleuzian thought, diagram of thought, is opposed to the thought with image of that is of Peircean diagram, that recognizes itself in the act of thinking and subjects thinking to a self-grounding in its representational activity. So let me drink some water. I hope I'm not exhausting you so far. It seems fair to say that the philosophy of becoming would include semiosis as long as we understand it as ever-growing relations between multiplicities. Since not only do relations have a being over and above their terms, but it is also the case that things or subjectivities are inherently related. That's a very important point. The issue at hand here is not that of becoming something or someone as a predetermined and fixed figure, but that of using this concept to focus on the creation or proliferation of new relations that change the previous figures themselves based on a new ontological relations, whether intersubjective or purely objective, which generates various interpreters. According to Atkins, far from attributing stability and change of a thing to its intelligible and sensible nature, or its substance and accidents in the Aristotelian model, Deleuze and Guattari re-articulate things in terms of assemblages, with two tendencies, not two kinds, to solve the paradox of change or intention or intensity, and stability or extensity. So we have these two tendencies that all things are tend towards. In this regard, I believe Deely's estimation and usage of the term essence seem rather ambiguous. Not only he refutes Neil Thomas' account of the essence and writes the essences of material substances are not in detail fixed and unchanging, end of quote, but even he later says, I almost hate to use it because it is so polluted in the resistance traditional philosophy put up to the ever-increasing evidence of science that no part of the universe is free from change and evolution. Therefore, at least for me, it is not clear whether his definition of the essence as an internal constitution or a positive abstraction, which is the substantial form, would be compatible with Deleuzian constructivist ontology or not. Particularly because Deely, quoting Aristotle, says, quote, there must indeed be such natural units or substances if the word is not simply one, because every many, by definition, presupposes ones. Even if somewhere else, he argues that we can only understand the essence or the quiddity of a thing by using objective relations as semiotic models, which can be accurate or inaccurate. In either case, Deleuze and Guattari are more concerned with the, as Bain says, the creation and articulation of relations in mobile assemblages, rather than with the representation of things. Here, experiencing is a reciprocal act between the organism and the physical world, both of which are constantly becoming on their own terms and in relation to each other. As Bain puts it, to become is to be in relation. Only as a logical abstraction could be there a non-relative empty structure of being by itself. To understand a being is to understand the field of relations that sustains it in its being in a world. So far, we can see that becoming is an event that is not separated from its sense. Whereas any event always occurs in between, the sense as the boundary between proposition and things, as Dolly says, can be understood as the event's counterpart in the field of semiosis. That is, as an effect or an interpretant of the event. So sense can be an interpretant of an event. It should be noted, however, that becoming is not any event of change, but only a molecular and rhizomatic deterritorialization, which is distinct from molar and arborescent or tree-like reterritorialization. In other words, it creates a gap between two reterritorializations. For whom that are acquainted with their philosophy, these terms are familiar, as Deleuze and Guattari frequently use them to draw a line between two different approaches, namely a continuous multiple micropolitics as opposed to discontinuous identical macropolitics. Any restrictive attempt to capture the free flow of desire as the main active force of life would disfigure the authentic and creative movement or the line of life of becoming, and entangle it to the economy and logical logos of being. If we want to translate this to Deely's terminology, I would suggest that the becoming is a change of course, not at the intersubjective level, but at the suprasubjective level, which by forming a new alliance between assemblages would extend their relations, that is their capacity to affect and be affected by the other as an expression of power, that is puissance versus pouvoir in French. And this is the same thing in both Deleuzian and Spinozian and even Nietzschean ethics. Sorry, I messed up a little. Okay. Furthermore, becoming is never the same. We have a multiplicity of becoming in the university of being, originally coined by Don Scottis, but Deleuze used this term as an account or interpretation of Spinozian ethics. And the university of being as a pure difference or a differentiating process, a cosmos always folding, unfolding, and refolding. Deleuze and Guattari named different kinds of becoming animal, becoming woman, becoming molecular, becoming imperceptible, etc. Nevertheless, all of them are instances of creation. The creation in its true sense is not just, moving from one point to another or changing a figure to another figure. In other words, what counts here is not the means or the destination, or telos, but the orientation of becoming. Atkins argues in the same way that, his words, there is a way in which all becoming is a becoming molecular, since the molar and molecular are the two poles toward which all things tend, static and change, extensive and intensive. These are the two poles. Becoming becomes through the intensive movement away from extension in a movement toward increasing intention. In this sense, in all assemblages, like that of language with its heterogeneous regions of signs, there are two usages, major and minor. In the fifth Plato, named the Postulates of Linguistics, Deleuze and Guattari distinguish the major language and the minor language, which are actually not two kinds, but rather, as they say, rather two usages or functions of language, of the same language. So soon we understand that they are not even talking about a dialectical relation of two poles, but two treatments of multiplicities or variables that constitute a language as an assemblage or a system. As they say, we were wrong to give the impression at times that constants existed alongside variables, linguistic constants alongside variables of enunciation. That was only for convenience of presentation. For it is obvious that the constants are drawn from the variables themselves. Universals in linguistics have no more existence in themselves than they do in economics and are always concluded from a universalization or a rendering uniform involving variables. Therefore, constant is not opposed to variable. It is a treatment of the variable opposed to the other kind of treatment or continuous variation. That is why Deleuze and Guattari assert that the majority and minority are qualitatively and not quantitatively different. This is mostly about power and domination. They say majority implies a constant of expression or content, serving as a standard measure by which to evaluate it, since it appears twice. Once in the constant and again in the variable from which the constant is extracted. Therefore, Deleuze and Guattari try to reverse the evaluation system as they consider the minority to be able to break through this molar model or constant identity in favor of continuous variables, realizing its own kind of power or puissance, the power to affect and being affected. They say, for the majority, insofar as it is analytically included in the abstract standard, is never anybody. Majority is never anybody. It is always nobody. While on the other hand, the minority is the becoming of everybody, one's potential becoming to the extent that one deviates from the model. We could say that by becoming the intensities that were captured in extensive figures, once again release and become creative, without any presumptive model or telos. The one in which constant and abstract standards of the majority deterritorialize. Deleuze and Guattari says in this regard, the problem is never to acquire the majority, even in order to install a new constant or territorialization. There is no becoming majoritarian. Majority is never becoming. All becoming is minoritarian. Women, regardless of their numbers, are minority, definable as a state or subset. But they create only by making possible a becoming over which they do not have ownership, into which they themselves must enter. This is a becoming woman affecting all humankind, men and women both. So we should note that the common examples of majority and minority duality, namely man or woman, adult or child, human and animal, heterosexual and homosexual, etc., both of them are molar categories that capture variables in constant figures. While the major categories are valuable, the others are strange. The minors are strange, stigmatized, or even deviant. Hence, the idea is not to become minor as a distinct subjectivity. Sorry, like woman, child, animal, like, etc. Because it would only reinforce the economy of standardization and categorization, subjugating the forces as perceptible, discernible, individuated, and hence predictable and finally controllable. More specifically, minoritarian politics has nothing to do with the so-called identity politics. Minority politics is a non-punctual line that, as Deleuze and Guattari says, has neither beginning nor end, departure nor arrival, origin nor destination. A line of becoming has only a middle, the in-between, the border or the line of life or escape, Lindusly, as they call it. So they even say that becoming has no history, you know, and it doesn't start from somewhere. It doesn't matter that where it starts or where it ends at the time. But I will talk about it later. Then for Deleuze and Guattari, what is real is the becoming itself. Not as they say, the supposedly fixed terms through which that which becomes passes. Penfield, in his article, which published in 2014, explains this point by naming the Foucauldian question of homosexuality and its filial project becoming queer. Becoming queer, which has two fundamental features. First, quote, as a relation that is still formless, friendship must be invented from A to Z. For its structure is unmoored from institutional supports and its meaning, ungoverned by dominant social codes. And second, with regard to its positive content, this relation between friends encompasses the sum of everything through which they can give each other pleasure, which is to say, the shared creation of a reciprocal circuit of care. End of quote. You can see this kind of becoming, for example, in the movie Call Me By Your Name, which released in 2017, but also in another movie for a large project in 1992. You can see both flyers here. So in the Call Me By Your Name, The two protagonists, Elio and Oliver, despite their differences, find a meaningful and life-changing bond. Were they secretly homos who suddenly came out of the closet? It does not matter at all because there is no queer as a state or a molar identity, just a variable of intensities that threw them into the threshold of becoming queer. My apologies. We now turn to our last subject. Following Deleuze and Guattari, I argue that as long as minorities cease to be identified as an aggregate or a state, that is, as a molar identity in relation to the majority or an ideal and standard, as an ideal and a standard, minorities have a special situation. Since a minority is capable of serving as the active medium of becoming. For example, unlike men, women never acquire any real privilege from being a woman. Even if they better bond with their body or self-appearance, as Alan Turing claims, their sexuality remains blurred and imperceptible, perhaps a perfect place for psychiatry and therapy to explore new disorders. My dear friend here, Robert Gianquera, suggested to me his words as women are a minority qualitatively, while being a majority quantitatively. A good way to refer to the class of women in English would be the overwhelming minority, which would do for a good thematic kernel per project. We'll see that, Robert. All in all, minorities have this privilege, this special situation to have a better chance to break through the constant order of things, to become a multiplicity. Because not only the majority, for example, man, white, adult, Christian, homosexual, heterosexual, etc., as the subject, but also the minority, that is woman, black, child, Jew, queer, etc., as the medium of becoming. So majority as the subject and minority as the medium of becoming should become a deterritorialized variable. Both of them should be deterritorialized. Deleuze and Guattari say in this regard, a woman has to become woman, but in a becoming woman of all men. A Jew becomes Jewish, but in becoming Jewish of the non-Jew. A becoming minoritarian exists only by virtue of a deterritorialized medium and subject that are its elements. There is no subject of the becoming except as a deterritorialized variable of the majority. There is no medium of becoming except as a deterritorialized variable of a minority. Right? Therefore, if successfully deterritorialized, man and woman, adult and child, white and black, heterosexual and homosexual, etc., can form an alliance that proliferates new relations of affection that go beyond and above their supposedly subjective parts, introducing new periodic sign relations. Instead of a typical conclusion, in the end, I would prefer to finish my talk with a famous example of becoming in 1,000 plateau. As you can see, the intriguing lines of the wasp and the bee orchid, in which we can see a mutually beneficial relationship, even based on a false or purely objective interpretation. This is why they become liberated from what separates them as distinct species. Deleuze and Guattari say, the line or block of becoming that unites the wasp and the orchid produces a shared deterritorialization of the wasp in that it becomes a liberated piece of the orchid's reproductive system, but also of the orchid, in that it becomes the subject of an orgasm in the wasp, also liberated from its own reproduction. A coexistence of two asymmetrical movements that combine to form a block down a line of light that sweeps away selective pressures. The line or the block does not link the vast to the orchid any more that it conjugates or mixes them. It passes between them, carrying them away in a shared proximity in which the discernibility of points disappears. Thank you very much. You can see the references here. And I should thank again my dear friend Zahra for creating this colorful and beautiful PowerPoint for me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shad, for your presentation. It was very lucid, clear, and enriching. And I would also like to thank Zara Soltani, who was collaborating with our team and providing flyers and design for us. Thank you very much for your wonderful job, Zara. And now I would like to introduce our commentator, Professor Dr. Susannah Ticciati. Dr. Ticciati is a professor of Christian theology at King's College London. She is author of Reading Augustine on Science, Christ, Truth, and the Interpretation of Scripture, published in London and New York 2022. A new apophaticism, Augustine and the Redemption of Science, published in Leiden, Boston in 2013, and many other significant works as well. Thank you very much, Dr. Ticciati, for accepting our invitation and being today with us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yulia, and thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here with you all and to be able to respond to such a fascinating paper. Thank you very much, Mahmoud Reza. I hope that's okay if I use your first names, and feel free likewise to call me Susannah. Yes, not only fascinating and thought-provoking as a paper in itself, but your initial comments inviting us to think about women in Iran makes us realize quite how pertinent your paper is, and well, how timely and why it matters so much. And so I hope we'll have that context in mind in thinking about the, well, quite what the ramifications of minoritarian politics might be in the world that we live in today. I'm offering my paper as my response, I should say, as a theologian, and specifically as a Christian theologian in a tradition of thinking shaped by Augustine of Hippo. You may have gathered from Yulia's introduction that I've written quite a bit on Augustine. I'm not in any way a Deleuzian specialist, so my response is very much out of the things that I know about. But I think there are some really interesting convergences, so I'm looking forward to exploring some of these. I also must thank Mahmoud Reza for sharing his paper with me in advance. That gave me adequate time to think about it a little bit more deeply. So these reflections come out of some dwelling with the paper a little bit more length, not just having heard it just now. So in returning to Augustine, I'll be returning to the roots of the semiotic trajectory traced by Deely, but I think in such a way as to discover their theological resources that, as far as I'm aware, he did not tap, but it may be that others have, and I'd love to hear actually if there's more work that's been done there. Nevertheless, Augustine may seem a surprising dialogue partner for Deleuze and Guattari. Deleuze, as a philosopher of immanence, is typically contrasted with theologians of transcendence. We might think of someone like Catherine Keller here, who puts them into dialogue in this, well, she complicates it, but nevertheless, you see that contrast there. I think this contrast overlooks a more interesting convergence. This does not mean that important differences don't remain. And once I've highlighted some of the significant convergences, I'll then identify some of the remaining differences, which will become the basis of a few critical questions I'd like to pose to Mahmoud Reza in respect of Deleuze and Guattari. And I've shared these with him in advance as well. Augustine's life as narrated in his Confessions might be understood precisely as a life of becoming. It's a story of restlessness, of cul-de-sacs, of transformative encounters, of relationships taken up and broken off. In Augustine's terms, it's the story of a mutable creature. Mutability, changeability, is for Augustine characteristic of the creature in distinction from the creator. The creature has no stable being, but is confected, made up of her relations with others and her changing relationship with herself. She's no more stable than the fleeting present, but is spread out and even pulled apart by the distension that is time, as well as by her internally conflicting will. She does not own herself as subject, but receives herself from God. Hence Augustine's famous claim that he can have no rest until he rests in God. And so far, I'm hoping you're hearing some of the Deleuzian notes, perhaps bracketing God, but nevertheless, this life of becoming seems to me to have really quite significant resonances with the way that Mahmoud Reza has interpreted Deleuze and Guattari. But to summarize Augustine, the only self he has is one that he discovers or indeed makes retrospectively. It is the self of his narrative. But even this is incomplete insofar as the narrative is written within time, soon to be engulfed in the further twists and turns of Augustine's life as it continues to unfold. There's no stable point from which to narrate one's life, so any grasp on that life is provisional and fleeting. It's a life of becoming, as I say. In Deely's terms, to translate in a different direction, it is a life of unfolding and proliferating sign relations, each moment gaining new significance in relation to what comes after it, these proliferating interpretants. Insofar as Augustine's life is constituted by his misperceptions as much as by his correct perceptions, and by a self-knowledge that is often misguided and in any case never complete, the common thread is relations as suprasubjective, to come back to Mahmoud Reza's key theme. For me, perhaps the most illuminating aspect of Mahmoud Reza's paper is the way in which he reads Deely in relation to Deleuze and Guattari, in a way that gives Deely an ethical casting. And this, I find it very interesting in Deely's work that I don't think he very often gets explicitly ethical. And your dialogue here, Mahmoud Reza, brings out the ethical really strongly in a way which I think is extremely important and really interesting. Taking this further, I'd like to suggest that Deleuze's ethics of becoming finds its counterpart in Augustine's ethics of creatureliness. Mahmoud Reza deftly shows how an ethics of becoming issues in a minoritarian politics, which enables a nuanced critique of the kind of identity politics that fixes and stabilizes a subject of self-expression or of self-identification. I suggest that a minoritarian politics could have close affinities with Augustine's account of mutable creatureliness. For neither can there be a fixed and self-constituting subject. But unlike Deleuze's minoritarian politics, Augustine's ethics does presuppose a telos, just not one that he can name. So it's not a creaturely telos. Equally, his theology is rooted in an account of the good, even if the good is not one that can be grasped by any creature, let alone be identified with a particular creature. In short, the creature is mutable, but the creature receives its mutable existence from the immutable God. God as the good is not at the disposal of creatures, but is rather that in the light of which all creaturely goals, norms, and goods are to be critiqued. But critique does not go all the way down. Deviance is not the whole story. God may not be identified with molarity, but nor are we left with an ethics of sheer molecularity. And correct me if I'm wrong in using those terms in that kind of way. This, however, is where my questions for Deleuze and Guattari arise. And I'll pose them to you, Mahmoud Reza, as their spokesman today. So here come my two questions. I hope we'll have time for some response from you. So one, if being is suspect, and the good is to be discovered in becoming as deviance, is there any good that can be defined other than negatively? Or to put this more bluntly, do Deleuze and Guattari have a vision of the good? Is it possible to have a good norm, would be another way of posing this question. And I have a particular interest in normativity as something that we might retrieve as good. So that's question number one. Do they have a vision of the good? Question number two, can one really have suprasubjectivity without a positive account of subjectivity? And to put this a bit more fully, do Deleuze and Guattari reduce subjectivity to molarity and thus retain subjectivity only as that which is to be critiqued? And would that be a problem if so? I think in both cases, my concern is that the good ends up being parasitic on the bad, suprasubjectivity on an oppressive hegemonic subjectivity, and deviance on a suspect being. In ethical terms, my concern is that the dissolution of good subjectivity will render minorities ever imperceptible and even parasitic on majorities for their being. Or perhaps even worse, and this is something I've learned from Sarah Ahmed, does it have the danger of making minorities merely instrumental in the becoming of majority subjects? How about, by contrast, one honours both relations and the terms of the relations, such as that we see them always as a pair in relation to one another, relations and things. I think this is quite close to what Deely is in fact doing in holding on both to suprasubjectivity and subjectivity. And this, I think, puts him in some contrast with Deleuze and Guattari. I'll stop there and hand back over to you, Mahmoud Reza, in the very, very short time that we have left, if you have some thoughts in response. Many thanks again.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to have you by myself today here, and I thank you that you sent me this response earlier, and so I can think about it and come up with a proper response to it actually. And I actually write it down. I cheated and write my answers down, and I'm afraid it got a little long. But I should, maybe I should explain these things during my presentation. But we have these limitations, and I'm very thankful to you to brought these ideas up, so I can talk about them more extensively. Sorry. So about the first question, if being is suspect and the good is to be discovered in becoming as deviance, is there any good that can be defined other than negatively? More bluntly, do Deleuze and Guattari have a vision of good? It is possible to have a good no. Well, the truth is the being is dubious. In that sense, as I quoted before from Deleuze and Guattari, that constants are drawn from variables and not the other way around. And that is exactly why becoming is not just a deviance from a supposedly principal and fundamental being, but it is the true and authentic order of cosmos in their views. As Paul Baines clarified this point, following Spinoza's idea of univocity of being, which I talked about it briefly during my presentation. It's coined by Don Scottis, but they use it in different way in interpretation of Spinoza philosophy, Spinozian philosophy. For Deleuze and Guattari, as Baines says, things, animals, or persons are defined by movements and rest, speeds, and slownesses, and by affects. These assemblages are individuations not of an already individuated object or person, but rather of relational events. End of quote. Moreover, I believe that following Nietzsche, they never accept that any good or value can be drawn negatively or reactively. In fact, for Nietzsche and for Deleuze and Guattari, the same. The reactive forces always end up in false or inverted values. As he discussed this crucial point in his genealogy of morality, particularly in his critique of Judeo-Christian traditional as a slave morality, that its main characteristic is ressentiment or resentment, not resentment. It's a completely different concept, which they use the French pronunciation in German. Or an inversion of system of values. This ressentiment is an inversion of system of values altogether. For example, where weakness and poverty praise and the eternal salvation promised to the poor or the le damné de la terre, the wretched of the earth. Controversially, Nietzsche would suggest that the genuine value beyond any good and evil, good und böse, only arises from the will to power. But here comes the trick point. This concept of power has nothing to do with the Hobbesian one, as Paul Patton clarifies it in his wonderful book, Deleuze and the Political, published in 2000. I've already mentioned, albeit briefly, that Deleuze and Guattari, together with Foucault, separate two kinds of power, namely pouvoir and puissance. Whereas both of them are defined according to interaction and relation, the former pouvoir is as the Hobbesian model repressive, dominative, and reactive, while the latter, puissance, is active and creative, even proliferating new relations. Likewise, Atkins believes that for Deleuze and Guattari, becoming is a virtue in the Spinozian sense of the term. He says, the more one is capable of affecting and being affected, the more power one has and more virtuous. End of quote. In short, I would suggest that we see becoming as an active force, not reactive, in terms of puissance instead of pouvoir. You may ask then, what happened to the special situation of minorities as deviant? Well, minorities are deviant as long as they remain minority. That is, as long as we define them through the major-minor duality, in which the major is always the standard and valuable model, and the minor always lacks authenticity. But through becoming, as I have mentioned, both the subject and medium of becoming, here the major and majority and minority, are deterritorialized. For example, even women must become women like men, and Jewish must become Jewish like non-Jews. Only after that, we would expect minorities to be deterritorialized as multiplicities or variables with their intensive power and form new relations and new values actively. Deleuze and Guattari have a vision of good, which is why they never assert that every possible instance of becoming is good person. Becoming is only a virtue if it continues to proliferate new relations, or you may say new channels as a plane of consistency or composition for life to flow in a molecular and rhizomatic way. After all, as Patty Thornton says in her article in 2005, it is a question of what a life can do, what a body can do. In other words, there is a vision of good, but not a predetermined one, and probably not as a norm. As dear Susannah thoughtfully alluded, Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy is following Spinoza and perhaps Nietzsche, a philosophy of immanence. In this regard, Atkins argued that his words, the very thought of becoming eludes good sense, and I would say even common sense, and suggests not a transcendence that would incur becoming and always reduce it to a telos toward which all becoming must tend, but as an immanent becoming that tends to in opposite directions at the same time, like as a rhizomatic, not arborescent, it's really like that. I don't know. I'm going to answer the second question. I don't know if you want to add something, Susannah, or not, before I turn to the second one.
Oh, I don't need to add anything, but can I just find out how much time we have overall so that I know, what's the end time?
We are absolutely okay with time. Please continue.
As long as we stand, you know.
Back to you. Yeah.
Okay. So about the second one, and these two questions are, in relation. You can see the similar subjects in these two questions. So maybe it's better to answer the second one too, and then discuss about it. You asked as your second question, can one really have suprasubjectivity without a positive account of subjectivity? To elaborate, Deleuze and Guattari reduce subjectivity to molarity and thus retain subjectivity only as that which to be critique. But you know, it's very fundamental question. You know, it's hard to answer, but I try my best. This question again refers to the fundamental problem of the primacy of being over becoming. Again, beginning with the book Difference and Repetition, which published in 1968, Deleuze always tried to present a critical view of Western philosophy in which unity and identity antecede universality and difference. Hence, we may ask, should be always beings as subjectivities having their distinct essence in their separation from the rest of the world as an individual existence, as we would describe it, for any possible interaction and relation in the first place? Should we have this, you know, subjectivities in this sense to have a suprasubjectivity or relation? Can't we change our perspective and see these beings as fundamentally related and changeable, which Deely partially do, and partly does, as I read it in some of his books. We can change our perspective and see these beings as fundamentally related and changeable, never fixed in an immediate and present idea or image to cogito or cogito, as in Cartesian representation. Be the creatures of the absolute being or not, beings as subjectivities are not absolute but related. Even if we see them having this tendency toward status, there's always another tendency toward change as well. We can have no relation to and therefore experience of an absolutely separated being that always remains absolutely isolated in its own world. Perhaps that is the reason why we couldn't experience the Almighty God so far. So I would suggest that it is a matter of a paradigmic turn in our perspective toward reality, in which the becoming is not secondary. While subjects and forms are constituted on the basis of what Deleuze and Guattari call the plane or plan of organization and development, yet there's another plane, namely the plane of consistency or composition. They say that is necessary given at the same time as that to which it gives rise through becoming, for example, which is this speeds and slowness between unformed elements and effects between non-subjectified powers. However, in order to avoid turning into pure plane of abolition or death, they ask, is it not necessary to retain a minimum of strata, a minimum of forms and functions, a minimal subject from which to extract materials, affects, and assemblages? It's a rhetorical question, I think. Perhaps for once, we can consider subjectivities as nth minimum and relations as nth maximum, beings maximums, and what by now. Finally, Atkins argues that Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy demands that what he called perceptual semiotics, it's a conception from Atkins. The main task of perceptual semiotics is to, his words, to discover the knots of becoming tangled in the fabric of being, to discover the rhizome in the tree. End of quote. The problem is not just that we use to mix up objects and things, as Deely said, but that we, in modern philosophy, he means, but that we introjected the falsely perceived or even falsely understood static image of nature to ourselves, causing us to lose creativity and our responsibility to change our attitude toward the life. That would be all of it. So I hope that, you know, makes any sense.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. May I pose a couple of further questions back to you?
Of course.
Yeah, in relation to your first answer, I find that very persuasive, and I'm really interested to hear that actually they're changing the valence there, and so that becoming is the creative primary term, and being is somehow the distorted something that one gets stuck with. So that I suppose invites one really to rethink the dichotomy altogether in order eventually to overcome it. That requires me to do a bit more thinking and perhaps some more reading as well. But I'm very intrigued by that kind of mode of response. I'm wondering if there's probably more conversation to be had about how immanence and transcendence might be rethought there in relation to one another to think about the good, because Deleuze and Guattari are definitely going for a kind of pursuit of immanence, which wants to see maximum possibility come to fruition. And often transcendence is heard as something which kind of clamps down on what's possible, and with one telos, a kind of some sort of hegemonic force. I'd want to read transcendence quite differently. So that's a place where we might open up some more convergence, in fact. In relation to the second question, I guess I'm sort of stuck on a logical problem here about how you can have relations without terms of relations. And for me, I think I'd want to say it like this, that you need both, and you've got to see them as a pair, that one is defined always in relation to the other. So I'm completely on board that you don't have subjectivities without the networks of relation in which they inhere. They're made up of their relations, in other words. But I'm not convinced that one can completely, that they can completely evaporate. And you did gesture towards this at the end when you were talking about a minimum of form that one might be required to have. I'm wondering if it needs to be so negative, though, if we from the get-go, as it were, we see subjectivity as always being defined through and through by relationality, rather than seeing them as pitted against one another. It seems to me this is ethically important, because if one doesn't have some account of who a subject is, can one really honor the those who are being oppressed, that one wants to kind of recover to speech and so on? So any further thoughts, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, they never say that the relation or possible without terms, but they see these terms differently, not as fixed, as fixed identities, entities, or constant things, as subjectivity in Deely's terminology. So, and it's like, if you change from the perspective of being, for a second, please, to the perspective of becoming, that makes sense. If you see everything in constant becoming, and you finally realize that, okay, I just, I can only see them as beings if they are fixed in a time and in place right now, and then we used to have this universal concepts. So we used to think in beings, in terms of beings, not becoming, and that become a problem of modern philosophy, as Deleuze and Guattari claims. I'm not the spokesman, by the way. It's very difficult to be the spokesman. It's damnation. They speaking dilemmas always, and you can. But I think even if you are not completely agree with them in some points, and you don't need to, you can, as I said before, you can use the concepts as a toolbox, and as something that encourage you to change your perspective, to change things in different way for once. And that's, for example, in the case of minority, I'm talking too much, sorry. In the case of minorities, I had always this problem with identity politics, and I didn't know what is the problem. I know I don't like. I think there's a problem. I had a problem with gay marriage even gay marriage, God forbid, even a gay marriage doesn't make sense. Something is not correct here. You know, it wasn't supposed to be pro-marriage, you know, in the first place. And then about 10 or more than about 12 years ago, when I was writing my MA dissertation, I, you know, encountered Deely's in philosophy through Paul Payton's book, as I mentioned the title before, and it's changed everything. Okay, suddenly I understood. Okay, that's why, you know, the minority we can just, you know, have keep this identity for minorities and change everything, you know, because this identity defined in this situation, defined in this condition, that we don't like it. Okay, so we can change it. We must change these categories, these identities, these stable and constant identities, if we want to have a you know, true change.
Thank you. I think I'm really with you on this, and I really liked the critique of identity politics as it appeared in your paper, because this seems to be something obviously wrong if all one's doing is joining in so-called minorities into the majority way of being, as it were. And gay marriage is a very interesting example of potentially of that. So I guess the question is there what one does instead, because that way of doing things seems to tick some boxes, and it's readily kind of made into policy, but it's much more difficult to know how you enact the minoritarian politics that you're after. And I'd love to know actually more, maybe at another point, how you would see that coming to fruition and what models there might be. So yeah, and I'm wondering whether part of the difference is rooted in this account of subjectivity that I'm hearing you critique. And actually, maybe this answers my second question more deeply than it's a further iteration of an answer, which is that the kind of subjectivity that Deleuze and Guattari are bothered about is precisely this stable, kind of fixed, pigeonholed identity, as it were, that we sometimes get in a certain kind of identity politics. But once you get rid of that, if we see subjectivity as always in flux, always in a process of becoming, we could reintroduce the term as paired with relation in a way that may be kind of accommodatable within their vision or within your use of their vision. And I don't mind which at this point. So yeah, maybe that's all I need to say for now. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, you know, I have always this example of, you know, the task or the responsibility of intellectuals in society. You know, I said that intellectuals, they shouldn't worry about the, you know, order or putting everything under order. They should, you know, just criticize the state of affairs, you know. And I can assure you that even if you see subjectivities in this way, there always are tendencies towards stability as well, static as well, as Atkins, you know, clarified this point. And it's not, you know, becoming. It's not about completely and violent deterritorialization. It's not about that, you know. It's always the process of folding and unfolding, deterritorialization and reterritorialization. But the becoming, it's the process of deterritorialization. But simultaneously we have another forces. If we have active forces, we have reactive forces, as you can see in Nietzschean philosophy, for example. You know, that, you know, they learned a lot from, they borrowed too many concepts and ideas from Nietzsche as well. And about the, is that all that you ask me, or there was something else I forgot.
No, I guess I was just trying to think with your vision and see if I'm hearing you correctly. Do I have time for one further question? I'm just looking to the moderator.
Absolutely.
Lovely, thank you.
Don't ask them. You know, they always, you know, give us time. Ask me if I can handle that. Okay. So.
There was just one little bit of my response that I missed out, and I want to come back to it to see if you think there's mileage here in a kind of expanded Deleuzian, Deeleyan vision, and it's seeing the subject in this slightly different way, so not as the fixed, stable, hegemonic subject actually, but rather as the subject as creature, which in other words means a subject who doesn't own itself, who's received, and who is constantly being put in relation with others, is constituted by relations with others. Now, this, of course, reintroduces transcendence. As soon as we talk about creature, we think creator, which is intentional on my part. So whether or not you want to go with that kind of language, I'm wondering whether you think that there might be the possibility for a translation there between a sort of Deleuzian philosophy and an Augustinian account of creatureliness.
Well, I have no specialty in theology so far, and you know, so it's I could just speculate maybe, but sure, why not? You know, but you must see, as I said before, you can use the concepts, ideas as a toolbox. Okay, so let's go. The same with Augustinian theory, but in this case, maybe you must be cautious about the limitations, about the borders. Okay, you can go this far, but not, you know, you can't go any further. Okay, because it's completely, for example, would be destructive to one of these theories. But yeah, I think as a creature, you can see them as creature, but the problem here is the most important problem here is that that they don't believe in any telos, any transcendental power. What you would do about that? You know, that's a big problem. That's because okay, in immanence you can have two different, you know, interpretation, and not surely not only religious one, but in transcendental philosophy, I don't know how you can have a, you know, non-religious, non-theological interpretation of these fellows beyond the beings, you know, and over the beings.
So. Yeah, certainly there's a sharp difference here. Whether there's a contradiction is another question, and I would want to argue that there isn't. I mean, partly because the kind of telos that Deleuze and Guattari, I think, are rejecting is of a rather different kind from the one that might be introduced by someone like Augustine, because the kind of telos he has he invokes is one that can't be specified or named, and is not within the realm that we know and understand, and thus it can't limit it. Indeed, you might even say that it opens it up. So yeah, there's a space for possible interaction where I think probably the differences can't be overcome, but one might at least reach a point of saying, oh, actually, where one might have seen contradiction, perhaps there isn't contradiction in quite that same way. And then there could be quite interesting borrowings across the boundaries. Now, I think you're absolutely right, though, that one doesn't want to erase all the boundaries for the sake of keeping the integrity of the different philosophies alive. But nevertheless, trying to move away from what are sometimes posed as contradictions might be quite fruitful in the dialogue.
Yeah, of course. And, you know, they say they don't believe in any telos, okay? But you know, as reading philosophy, reading history of philosophy, you don't have to, you know, believe anyone by his or her word. Okay, you can find some telos actually. Okay, that's you know, I heard that, for example, someone says, okay, Foucault says that I'm liberal, so you can look him as a liberal person. Okay, just only he says so. No, they said they don't have any tellus, but I see some tellus, but it's not, you know, a transcendental tellus, perhaps a logical tellus for, you know, continuing for relations to you know, continue proliferation, or for becoming to continue, you know, as, for example, life to continue, and even, you know, beyond life, that must continue, that the becoming stay possible, you know, in the first place. For example, you can see this kind of, you know, presupposed value, for example, as you may call it, in Nietzschean philosophy as well. Okay, what's the Superman's Uberman value? You can say, okay, Uberman is beyond man. It can beyond any good and bad. Okay, but okay, I see that the life plays an important role here. Okay, to be powerful as Uberman in distance of power, you must respect life. You have no other choice. Can you imagine? Another example came to my mind. Most of you you have watched the film Matrix. You know, in a scene, the inspector, you know, compare humans with viruses. Say, you two species are like each other, because no other species in the world, you know, this just have this destructive behavior towards its host. Only viruses and humans. Okay, and that's the point. You can't just say, okay, the Uberman has this power. Okay, we have this power in the sense of puissance. Okay, we have becoming. Okay, but we don't care about the, you know, rest of the world. We don't care about the universe. Okay, there must be something that you become in. Okay, and this becoming to proliferates, this coming to in order to proliferate new relations, there must be some okay, value or tellus or good or something that you assay with it.
Such interesting reflections, and particularly when it comes to Nietzsche and then the connection with the Matrix. Yeah, absolutely. Those are just the kind of things I would want to probe about what might be being presupposed about an ultimate good. I mean, you've got to value life if you're going to embrace this vision. Why is life being valued here? Is some kind of assumption being made which is not being put on the table? And if it were, could one then debate it? And what other values might be brought in order to jostle with it, as it were? And I guess it comes back to my question of a good norm. I mean, is it true that for Nietzsche, life, to affirm life, that's a good norm? And if so, does it need to be debated? I guess those are where my sorts of slightly prodding questions would come back in about, well, is a telos always in some sense operative? So I'm really fascinated to find you sort of discovering those possible teloi sort of lurking there, even if in a slightly different way. So yeah, fascinating. Thank you very much. I think probably that wraps up where my questions for now, although there are many things that I want to pursue with you at another point, in particular, how you would want to sort of map this out politically. And maybe I need to go and read some more of your work in order to find out. So for example, your Becoming Minority, a Revolutionary Act, I think may answer some of the questions I have in this regard. But yeah, huge thanks to you for your paper and all the responses.
Thank you very much. I'll be in touch, and I'll be more than happy to, you know, share these ideas with you and learn from you, actually, Susannah.
Likewise. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've already learned very much, so I'm in your debt.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ticciati. It was really outstanding comment, and thank you very much for bringing in Augustine's thought and making it this dialogue between Christian theology and the Deleuzian postmodern thought. It's fantastic. I would like now to announce to our audience in YouTube that we will be closing the broadcast. But here, the discussion will continue, and everybody present here on Zoom are welcome to participate. Please, you can turn on the sound or give me a sign.